Sign it, or I tell the FBI you opened that valve. It's a lie they'll believe. Your name is on every report.
11:23 Calumet Harbor, and the phone taped under the dashboard of the car, parked behind the containers, had been recording for 6 minutes before either of them raised their voice. The phone had been face down on the passenger seat of the car, parked behind the containers for 11 minutes, before David Park realized what it had caught, and by then the recording had a name in it that belonged to no filing he had ever seen. He did not start the engine. He sat with the harbor lights coming off the water in long orange bars, and let the file run to the end, 41 seconds of a man threatening to hand his own niece to federal investigators for a crime she had never committed unless she signed a confession that would clear him instead. Zara stood at the gangway of the MV Constance, with the folder still open in her hands. The pen Desmond had pressed on her still uncapped, and she did not sign it. She did not argue either. She closed the folder along its spine, the way she closed every survey file, corners squared, and she said she would need until Friday to review the hull data before she put her name on anything. Desmond told her. Friday was not an option, the bank recognized, and it was only then, as an afterthought meant to close the argument, rather than open a new one, that he told her the loan they had co-signed together 3 years ago carried a clause that would come looking for her long after any FBI file had gone cold. He said it the way he said most things to her lately, evenly as a fact rather than a threat, and that was the part that frightened her more than shouting would have. Above them, the crane arms sat still against the sky, and the containers stacked along the apron threw shadows long enough to swallow the space between two people who had once eaten dinner at the same table every Sunday. Zara had surveyed 41 vessels for Bennett Freight Lines since she got her license, half of them for a rate her uncle called a family discount, and she had come to understand as something closer to a lien on her time. She had never once found a hull she could not account for. That was the thing. Sitting under her ribs at 11:23, not fear exactly, but the specific cold of a woman watching a number refuse to balance. The water slapped against the Constance's plating in a rhythm too even to be wind, and somewhere behind them a forklift finished its last run of the shift and went quiet, leaving only the harbor and the two of them and a folder she had not signed. Desmond told her the insurer's adjuster was flying in from Milwaukee on Thursday, and that a clean statement from the surveyor of record would close the file before anyone thought to ask a second question. Zara asked what question he was worried about. He did not answer that. He told her again that federal investigators had no reason to believe a licensed surveyor over the word of the company that had employed her for a decade, and that the loan clause he had already mentioned once tonight would still be waiting for her long after any confession she refused to sign. She held the folder against her chest and walked back down the gangway without another word, her boots loud on the metal grating, and behind her, Desmond stayed at the rail with his phone already lit, already dialing someone whose name she did not catch. Zara did not cry in the truck. She sat in the driver's seat of her survey van with the folder on the passenger side and photographed every page of it with her own phone, page by page. Flash off the dome light killed so no one on the dock would see the glow. She wrote the loan number from memory onto the back of an inspection card before she started the engine because she did not trust herself to remember it by morning, and she drove home along the lake with the folder locked in the glove box and her hands steady on the wheel in a way the rest of her was not. 3 years earlier, the kitchen table in her father's house had 2 coffee cups on it and a stack of bank forms. Neither of them had wanted to be the one to open. Her father had been dead 11 weeks. And Desmond had shown up every Tuesday since the funeral with groceries and a folder of paperwork telling her that family businesses survived by family staying close to the numbers, that he needed her name on the refurbishment note for the Constance, because the bank trusted a licensed surveyor more than it trusted a man 3 years behind on 2 other loans. She had signed because he was the only uncle she had left, and because the number on the page, $2,140,650, had seemed at the time like a bridge rather than a debt, something she was building toward a family that still had a shape. Nobody had explained to her what a change of control clause was, or that co-signing a note meant standing under it long after the person who asked her to sign had stepped out from beneath it himself. She had learned marine surveying the hard way, 3 years at a community college night program after her shift at a freight office, then an apprenticeship under a surveyor named Ruth Okafor, who taught her to read a hull the way other people read a face for the places it was trying not to show weakness. Ruth had told her once that a stress fracture never lied about how it started, only about how long it had been lying. Zara carried a laser thickness gauge in a case older than her license, and a habit of tapping a hull plate with a small brass hammer before she trusted any instrument reading because sound told her things, numbers sometimes smoothed over. She had built a reputation on 3 words other surveyors in the region used about her without irony: thorough, unbribable, slow. And she had never once minded being called slow, because slow was the only speed at which she had ever found the truth. 4 years before the night at the gangway, she had been sent to survey the MV Halcyon Pride for an underwriter covering park terminal cargo, a routine hull inspection, ahead of a policy renewal. And she had spent 6 hours in a ballast tank with a headlamp and a notebook, while the terminal's owner stood on the dock waiting for a report he expected to be boilerplate. David Park had not introduced himself when she came up the ladder soaked to the knees and smelling of bilge water. I had asked her instead why she had flagged a weld on frame 40 that the shipyard's own certificate called sound, and she had shown him the hammer test log and the 2 degrees of temperature differential that explained it. And he had stood there a long moment, reading her handwriting, before he said the shipyard would be hearing from him. It was not romantic, not then. It was the particular attention of a man who ran a terminal, built on other people cutting corners around him, watching a woman refuse to cut one. And something in him had filed that away without naming it. They had crossed paths twice more in 4 years. Both times over cargo disputes, both times with the same unhurried respect, and neither of them had done anything about it because there had never been a reason to. Zara pulled into her own driveway at 12:40 that night, with the folder still locked in the glove box, and she sat in the dark for a long minute before she went inside, not because she was afraid of Desmond, but because she had just understood with the clarity of a stress fracture, finally showing its full length, that the man who raised her after her father died had built her into the exact shape of a person who would carry his weight without asking why. Her toolkit had not changed since the apprenticeship. A laser gauge, the brass hammer, a waterproof notebook with grid pages, and a habit Ruth Okafor had drilled into her of writing down what she expected to find before she climbed into a tank, so that a surprise would announce itself against her own prediction rather than hide inside a vague sense that something felt wrong. She kept every survey report she had ever filed on an external drive labeled by hull number, not by client name, because clients changed their story about a ship far more often than the steel did. The Constance had come through her hands twice before, once for a routine certification and once after a minor grounding near Sturgeon Bay, and both times the ballast system had logged clean, no history of manual override outside scheduled maintenance windows. That history was the first thing that had snagged in her when Desmond described a storm. The Constance's own weather log did not fully support a swell height that did not match the National Weather Service bulletin for that stretch of the lake on the night in question. She had not said this to him at the gangway. She had learned 3 years into carrying his debt that questions asked out loud in front of Desmond had a way of becoming problems she alone was assigned to solve. The night she met David Park, she had climbed out of the Halcyon Pride's No. 3 ballast tank with grease on both forearms and a headlamp fogging in the cold, expecting the usual dockside audience of men who wanted a report that matched what they had already decided to believe. Instead, she found a man in a plain wool coat, standing apart from his own terminal staff, arms crossed, watching the hatch rather than his phone. And when she handed over her preliminary notes, he read them standing up in the wind instead of folding them into a pocket for later. He asked 2 follow-up questions about the weld on frame 40 before he asked her name, and when she told him, he wrote it down himself rather than having an assistant do it in a small leather notebook he kept in his coat. 3 weeks later, his terminal sent the shipyard a formal notice of non-conformance built almost entirely from her hammer test log, and she had heard through a colleague that Park had stood in the meeting and read her findings aloud line by line without softening a single one of them for the room. She had not thought much more about him after that. Beyond a professional respect she extended to perhaps 4 people in the entire industry until the second cargo dispute. 2 years later put them on a conference call together for 90 minutes, during which he had asked her opinion on a disputed cargo weight discrepancy and then unusually taken it over the opinion of his own operations director. Neither of them had ever said anything to suggest the respect was anything else, and Zara had built her life carefully enough by then that she had no room in it to wonder. She did not know, driving home from the Constance that night, with a folder locked in her glove box, that the same man had just finished listening to 41 seconds of her uncle's voice, threatening her with a debt that was never supposed to have been hers to carry. She only knew that the harbor behind her had gone quiet the way it always did, after midnight cranes still water flat, and that somewhere in that quiet a number was waiting for her to either sign it into truth or prove it a lie. Desmond found out about the photographs 9 days later. Not because Zara had been careless, but because the insurer's portal logged every access to a claim file by timestamp and user credential, and someone in his own office mentioned in passing that the surveyor of record had pulled the Constance's archived AIS records at 1 in the morning using her own login rather than the shared company account. He did not call her about it. He drove to her office instead on a Thursday while she was out on a job in Gary and asked her assistant, a college student named Priya, who handled her scheduling 2 days a week, to let him into the file room to retrieve what he called his own company's records. Priya let him in because he was listed as a client of record and because nobody had told her not to, and he spent 11 minutes alone with the filing cabinet before he left with nothing visibly in his hands, though Zara would later find that the physical folder containing her original survey notes on the Constance, the ones with her handwritten hammer test results, had been reorganized in a way she never left a file. I was not looking to destroy it, not yet. I was looking to know exactly what she had and exactly how far ahead of him she already was, and what he found told him she was further ahead than he had allowed for. That same week, the claim was submitted to Lakeshore Mutual Insurance with a surveyor's statement attached bearing Zara's signature and her license number, a statement she had never written and never signed, built from a scanned signature page lifted off a survey report she had filed 18 months earlier for an unrelated vessel. Zara learned about the statement from the underwriter's office, directly a courtesy call from a claims examiner named Robert Voss, who wanted to confirm a technical detail in what he assumed was her own report, and it was in the middle of that call, reading a paragraph. He read back to her over the phone that she understood her name had been put on a document she had refused to sign at the gangway 9 days earlier. She did not call Desmond. She did not call the insurer back to accuse anyone of anything. She thanked Robert Voss for the courtesy call, told him she would review the statement and follow up in writing, and hung up the phone in a kitchen that had gone very quiet around her. Zara spent that night building a second copy of everything, a habit she had learned from Ruth Okafor years earlier, for exactly this reason. Survey files backed up to a drive that never touched her office network. Time-stamped photographs of the original folder from the night at the gangway, and a written account of the Thursday visit that she asked Priya to read and sign as a witness statement before either of them said the word fraud out loud. She drove to the harbor master's office the following morning and requested her own copy of the Constance's AIS transponder history directly from the Vessel Traffic Service, a public record any licensed surveyor could pull, and paid the $11 fee in cash, so there would be no card statement Desmond's accountant might later see. The data took 4 days to arrive by mail, printed on Coast Guard letterhead, and when it did, it showed the Constance holding a fixed position at the Bennett freight dock for the entire 6-hour window, during which the insurance claim described the vessel taking on water in open swells 11 miles northeast. That single sheet closed something in Zara that had been open since the funeral, 11 weeks after her father died, the last quiet hope that Desmond's version of events might somehow still turn out to be true. It was in the maintenance log, not the AIS data, that the second thread appeared, a routine ballast system entry, time-stamped for the night in question, and initialed by a deckhand named Corey Delgado, countersigning a manual valve inspection that the log described as unremarkable. Zara had surveyed the Constance's crew roster as part of every inspection for 3 years, and she remembered Corey Delgado's name specifically because he had been on unpaid medical leave since August, a fact she confirmed within an hour by calling the crewing agency that staffed Bennett Freight and asking without explaining whether Delgado had returned to active duty. He had not. Someone had initialed the safety log with a sick man's name on a night that log was meant to explain. And Zara sat with that fact for a long time before she wrote it down, because it meant the falsification went deeper into the company than one desperate uncle standing at a gangway. Desmond's second move landed 19 days after the first in public at the Regional Great Lakes Shippers Conference in Milwaukee, where Zara had been invited to sit on a panel about hull integrity standards, a small honor she had earned over a decade of unglamorous, careful work. He filed a formal complaint with the State Marine Surveyors Licensing Board that morning, alleging that Zara had certified a vessel, a barge unrelated to the Constance, without completing a required interior inspection 2 years earlier, a claim built from a scheduling note he had access to only because he was listed as the client on that job. The board notified her by email 40 minutes before her panel began, a formality requiring no immediate response, but word of the complaint reached the conference floor faster than any formality carried by a colleague who meant well and told 2 other people who did not. She sat on the panel anyway. She answered every question about ultrasonic thickness testing and corrosion allowance with the same even voice she had used at the gangway. While 3 rows back, a man she had known her entire professional life watched her from a folding chair with an expression that told her more clearly than any statement could have that he intended to make her unemployable before he let her make him a criminal. She did not know walking off that stage to polite applause, and at least one conversation that stopped when she got close enough to hear it, that David Park had been in the back of that same conference room for the ultrasonic panel, and that he had watched a room full of her professional peers decide in real time how much benefit of the doubt a black woman surveyor was owed against the word of a white adjacent shipping family name they had known for 20 years. He did not approach her that day. I watched her walk to the parking structure alone, declining 2 offers of a ride from colleagues who had not stopped to defend her 20 minutes earlier. And he understood that whatever he did next would have to be built entirely on paper, because a man who tried to fix this with his presence alone would only give the room another reason to talk about her. The licensing board complaint did not go away on its own, and it could not because Zara had learned enough in a decade of survey work to know that ignoring a formal filing was itself a kind of admission. She hired an attorney of her own that week, a contract review specialist named Marion Ash, who had handled 2 prior disputes for surveyors in the region and paid the retainer out of savings she had been building since before her father died, $4,100 that had been meant for a down payment on an office of her own. Marion read the barge inspection note Desmond had submitted to the board and found within an hour that the interior inspection he claimed she had skipped was documented in her own field notebook, dated and witnessed by the barge's chief engineer, a man who still worked in the industry and would, if asked, confirm every page of it. It was not a fast fix. Marion explained that board complaints moved on their own calendar weeks at minimum before a response was even due, and that the smarter use of the time between now and then was not defending the barge inspection, but finishing the case. Zara had already half built without meaning to. Zara went back to the loan. She requested her own certified copy of the promissory note from Great Lakes Maritime Bank, the same document she had signed at her father's kitchen table 3 years earlier, and read the change of control clause for the first time with a lawyer beside her instead of a grieving woman alone with a man she trusted. The clause was 7 lines long, and it said in language dense enough that she understood exactly why Desmond had never once summarized it for her, that if the primary borrower defaulted or was found to have materially misrepresented the collateral securing the loan, the bank could pursue either cosigner for the full outstanding balance, $2,140,650, without first exhausting its claims against the company itself. Marion underlined the phrase materially misrepresented the collateral twice and told Zara that an insurance fraud finding on the very vessel that collateralized the note would trigger that clause almost automatically, which meant the bank's interests and Zara's interests, for the first time in 3 years, were about to point in exactly the same direction. That was the shape of the second thread Zara had been circling since the ballast log, the falsified entry under Corey Delgado's name, and she spent 4 nights that week cross-referencing every maintenance log Bennett Freight had filed with the Coast Guard for the past 18 months, looking for the same handwriting, the same shorthand notation Delgado used for a completed inspection on nights she could independently confirm he had not been aboard. She found 2 more. Each one sat quietly in a stack of paperwork. Nobody outside a handful of harbor officials would ever read twice, and each one meant that whoever had opened that ballast valve on the night the Constance took on water had done it before, on a smaller scale, and had gotten away with it cleanly enough to try again for $4,682,955. Zara did not sleep much that week. Not from fear anymore, but from the particular alertness of a woman assembling a case with her own 2 hands, for the first time since her father's death, when she had signed things because someone told her to and had never once asked to see the full 7 lines for herself. The folder from the gangway sat in a fireproof box in her hall closet, now alongside the certified AIS record, 3 maintenance logs bearing a sick man's forged initials, and Marion Ash's card, and Zara understood closing the lid on that box each night that the number she had refused to sign 3 weeks earlier was never going to be either signed into truth or quietly forgotten. It was going to be answered on paper in the order she chose, and by nobody's authority but her own. She did not know yet that a car had been parked behind the containers on the night it started, or that the 41 seconds sitting on a phone in David Park's glove box already matched almost word for word the promissory note's own language about debt and who was left to carry it. She only knew that Friday the deadline, Desmond had told her the bank would never honor had come and gone 11 days ago without a single call from Great Lakes Maritime Bank, and that the silence itself was the loudest thing that had happened to her in 3 weeks. Priya asked her once, locking up the office on a Friday, whether she was going to be all right, and Zara told her the truth that she did not know yet, but that she had stopped waiting to find out by accident. She had spent 3 years letting a folder tell her what to sign and a family tell her what to forgive, and the fireproof box in her closet was the first thing she had built entirely on her own terms. One certified record at a time, with no one's permission required but her own, and no deadline but the one she set herself. Marion Ash called on a Tuesday morning to say the licensing board had opened a preliminary review and would want the barge inspection notebook within 30 days, a timeline that gave Zara room to breathe for the first time since Milwaukee, and she hung up the phone and stood in her kitchen, a long moment, looking at the same table where her father's coffee cups had once sat beside a stack of forms she had signed too fast. David Park had listened to the 41-second recording 11 times by the end of that first week, not because he needed convincing, but because each time he heard Desmond Bennett tell his niece she would carry a debt alone. He found a new detail in his own memory of her, that the recording reframed the exactness of her hammer test log on the Halcyon Pride, the way she had never once in 4 years of professional contact asked him for anything. He did not call her, he told himself, driving away from Calumet Harbor that first night with the recording saved in triplicate, that a woman who had spent 3 years learning not to trust the men in her life did not need a fourth one arriving with a file full of good intentions and no invitation. He respected the shape of her silence, the way he respected a hull that had not yet failed as evidence of integrity rather than an opening to walk through uninvited. So he did what he knew how to do instead, which was paperwork, and he had his own attorney, a maritime finance specialist named Grant Whitlow, who had handled every acquisition Halcyon Terminal had made in a decade, quietly researched the ownership structure of the note Zara had co-signed. It took Whitlow 6 days to confirm what David had suspected from the first listen, that Great Lakes Maritime Bank had already begun classifying the Bennett freight note as a troubled asset internally, and that under the bank's own portfolio policy notes, flagged that way, were often sold at a discount to private buyers willing to take on the collection risk rather than carried on the bank's books through a lengthy default process. David told Whitlow to make an offer for the note not to Desmond, not through Bennett Freight, but directly to the bank's asset disposition desk. A legitimate buyer stepping into a legitimate market for distressed commercial debt, the same transaction any private lender in the region might have made for entirely unrelated reasons. It took 3 weeks of negotiation, 2 rounds of due diligence on the underlying collateral, and a purchase price, 11 cents on the dollar below the note's face value, before Great Lakes Maritime Bank agreed to sell, and by the time the paperwork closed, David Park held the $2,140,650 note that Zara Bennett had co-signed at her father's kitchen table 3 years earlier. He did not call her about that either. Not yet, because holding the note changed nothing about the collection timeline, unless he chose to act on it, and he had not decided yet what acting on it should look like. What he had decided, the first week before any of the paperwork started, was that he would spend 1 evening a month in his own past, the way she had clearly spent hers, and it had been longer than a month since he had made himself sit in his mother's dining room and answer for choices she had never stopped believing were mistakes. His mother, Diane Park, still ran Park Maritime Group from the same office overlooking the Chicago River that his grandfather had opened it in, and she had never fully forgiven him for walking out of that office 9 years earlier to build Halcyon Terminal on borrowed capital rather than inherited authority. She served him kimchi jjigae, the way she always did when she wanted him to sit still long enough to be lectured, and she told him halfway through the meal that she had heard from a shipping contact about a fraud investigation brewing at Bennett Freight, and that she hoped he had the sense to stay out of another family's mess when he had never finished cleaning up his own. David asked her what she meant by his own mess, and she set down her spoon and reminded him in the flat, exhausted tone she used only for this one subject, that he was the eldest son of a company that had been passed down for 3 generations, and that every year he spent running a terminal with his own name on the lease instead of the family's was a year closer to there being no Park left willing to take the seat at the head of that table when she was gone. Ha told her, as he had told her for 9 years, that he had tried sitting in that seat once at 26 for 18 months, and that the version of himself who had run supply contracts through relationships his grandfather built, rather than ones he had earned, had been the least honest year of his life. Diane did not answer that directly the way she never did, but she asked him almost as an afterthought while clearing the table whether the woman at the center of this fraud investigation was the same surveyor who had once made him rewrite an entire cargo insurance policy over a welded seam. And when he said yes, his mother went quiet in a way that told him she had already guessed more than she was saying. He drove home that night thinking less about the note in his desk drawer and more about the particular loneliness of being the son who left a loneliness that had never fully closed, no matter how solid the terminal's foundations had turned out to be. And he understood in a way he had not quite let himself before that watching Zara refuse to sign a document under pressure had moved something in him precisely because he had spent his own life learning far too late to do the same thing. The connection between them, when it came, was not a phone call or a dinner invitation. It was a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after the gangway, when David's terminal received a routine cargo manifest dispute from Bennett Freight Lines regarding a shipment that had passed through Halcyon's berths, and David, reviewing the paperwork himself instead of routing it to his operations director, recognized Zara's inspection stamp on the manifest's cargo weight certification and understood it as an opening that had nothing artificial about it at all. He called the number on the certification not to discuss the manifest, but because the dispute gave him a professional reason to speak with her, for the first time since the recording, and when she picked up brisk and businesslike, expecting a question about cargo tonnage. He asked her instead whether she had 11 minutes to talk about something that was not the manifest at all. There was a long pause on the line, long enough that he almost apologized and hung up before she asked him in a voice that had gone very careful how he knew there was something else to talk about. I told her the truth, that his car had been parked behind the containers at Calumet Harbor 3 weeks earlier for reasons that had nothing to do with her, and that its recorder had caught something he did not think she knew was on tape, and that he was not calling to offer help. She had not asked for only to tell her the recording existed and that it was hers whenever she wanted it. Zara did not say anything for a long moment, and when she did speak, it was to ask him a single question. Careful and exact in the way she asked every question that mattered, whether he had listened to all 41 seconds or only enough to understand the shape of it. I told her he had listened to all of it more than once and that he was sorry it existed at all. Sorrier still that it had taken him 3 weeks to find a reason to tell her instead of just calling. It was Zara, not David, who suggested they meet at a diner near the harbor rather than either of their offices, because she had learned 3 years into carrying Desmond's debt that the safest rooms were the ones where nobody had a reason to expect her. They met on a Thursday evening in a booth at the back of a diner 3 blocks from the harbor, and David arrived first, choosing the seat facing the door out of a habit he had never bothered to examine. And when Zara came in, 11 minutes late from a job, and Gary still smelling faintly of bilge water and cold lake air, he noticed she chose the seat facing the door too, and neither of them mentioned it. He did not touch the folder he had brought with him for the first 20 minutes. He asked her about the manifest dispute, first genuinely, because the cargo weight discrepancy was real and needed resolving, regardless of anything else between them, and she answered him with the same precision she gave every technical question, and it was only after the waitress cleared their coffee cups that he finally slid a small drive across the table, the recording copied onto it, along with a printed transcript he had made himself, rather than asking an assistant to type it. Zara, read the transcript in silence twice, her thumb tracing the line where her own voice asked her uncle whether he wanted her to say the crew had opened the valve. And when she finished, she did not thank him, and she did not cry. She asked him instead whether Halcyon Terminal had any record of vessel movements near Calumet Harbor on the night in question. Because a second independent source for the AIS timeline would matter more in front of a federal investigator than her own certified copy alone. It was the most David had said to anyone in years without either of them mentioning what he might be feeling, and he found watching her fold the transcript into a bag already heavy with a decade of careful habits that he did not mind at all. High gave her what she asked for within 2 days. Halcyon's own harbor traffic logs corroborating the Constance's fixed position that night, an independent dataset from a source Desmond had no reason to suspect existed, and he did it without asking anything in return, because he had learned watching his mother run a company on obligation and inherited debt that help freely given was the only kind that did not eventually collect interest. Over the following weeks, they met 3 more times, always at the diner, always with a professional reason on paper, a manifest, a birth schedule, a maritime insurance panel they were both invited to speak at, and each time the conversation drifted a little further from cargo and a little closer to the 2 people carrying it. David told her on the third visit about the 18 months he had spent trying to run Park Maritime Group at 26 and how his mother still measured every year since as a year of failure rather than a year of finding his own footing. And Zara told him in turn about her father's kitchen table and the 2 coffee cups and a stack of forms she had signed because grief made trust feel like the only decision left available to her. Neither of them called it anything. The piece that finally moved the case forward came from Zara herself. 4 weeks after the diner, when she requested the Constance's full structural monitoring data from the shipyard that had installed its hull sensors 8 years earlier, a system that logged ballast pressure continuously and stored 90 days of readings before overwriting them automatically. The shipyard's records office told her the data had already been requested and pulled by Bennett Freight's own operations manager the week after the storm claim was filed, ostensibly for routine maintenance review, and that the original sensor log had since been marked corrupted in the shipyard's backup system, a convenient failure that told Zara almost as much as an intact file would have. She did not accept corrupted as an answer. She drove to the shipyard herself, spent 6 hours with a data recovery technician named Alvin Cho, who specialized in marine electronics, and together they pulled the raw sensor readings directly from the Constance's onboard controller rather than the shipyard's overwritten backup, a controller nobody had thought to touch because nobody outside a licensed surveyor would have known it kept its own independent 6-month buffer. What came back line by line across 6 hours of readings showed a ballast pressure drop at 10:14 that evening, consistent with a manually opened valve, not storm stress, followed by a second smaller drop. 19 minutes later that matched no weather event on record anywhere in the National Weather Service bulletin for that stretch of the lake. Zara sat in the recovery lab with Alvin Cho at midnight and understood that she was holding for the first time a piece of evidence that did not depend on anyone's memory, anyone's testimony, or anyone's willingness to tell the truth, only on the steel itself, which Ruth Okafor had promised her all those years ago never lied about how a fracture started. She called David that night past midnight, not because the diner rule about professional reasons still applied, but because she no longer had one and did not care. 6 weeks after the gangway, Desmond Bennett called a meeting in the Bennett Freight Line's conference room to close the Constance claim, the same table where he had once explained a change of control clause to a grieving woman who had not thought to ask a lawyer to read it first. And this time Zara sat at the far end of it with a folder of her own closed corners squared waiting. I had asked for the meeting believing Lakeshore Mutual was finally ready to release the $4,682,955, and he arrived 12 minutes early in the good suit he wore for closings, already rehearsing the version of gratitude he intended to perform for his niece in front of the claims examiner he had invited to witness it. He did not know that the claims examiner Robert Voss had spent the previous week reviewing a certified AIS record and 3 falsified maintenance logs that Zara's attorney had submitted to Lakeshore Mutual's Special Investigations Unit, or that Voss had come to this meeting not to release a payment, but to observe one being unmade. Desmond opened the meeting the way he opened every meeting he believed he had already won, thanking the room for its patience, noting that the claim had taken longer than any storm loss he had filed in 30 years of running Bennett Freight, and turning to Zara with the particular warmth he reserved for moments he expected to end in his favor, telling the table that his niece had always been the most careful surveyor on the lake, careful enough that nobody in this room would ever have reason to doubt a number she put her name to. He said it lightly, the way a man says something he believes has already been settled, and he did not notice that Zara had not smiled, had not touched the folder in front of her, had simply waited for him to finish, so the table could hear what she had actually come to say. She opened the folder and set the first page in the center of the table, pale manila an inch of paper beneath it, and she turned it so that Robert Voss could read the caption before she said a single word about what it contained, the Coast Guard's own certified transponder history for the MV Constance, stamped with the harbor master's seal showing 6 unbroken hours at dock on the night the claim described open water storm damage 11 miles northeast. Desmond's face did not move for a full second. The particular stillness of a man recalculating faster than his expression could keep up, and Zara set the second document beside the first 3 maintenance logs bearing Corey Delgado's initials on nights. The crewing agency confirmed him on unpaid medical leave, each one photograph dated and cross-referenced against payroll records Marion Ash had subpoenaed 2 weeks earlier. Robert Voss picked up the transponder record himself and read it twice, and in the quiet that followed, Zara laid the third document on the table, a forensic printout from Alvin Cho's recovery lab showing the Constance's own onboard sensor buffer, A pressure drop at 10:14, consistent with a manually opened ballast valve, followed 19 minutes later by a second drop matching nothing in the National Weather Service record for that stretch of the lake. Numbers first, then paper, then last, the recording. And Zara nodded once toward the door where David Park had been standing without a word since the meeting began. A man Desmond had not thought to question the presence of, because he had assumed wrongly that a terminal owner sitting in on an insurance closing meant nothing more than professional courtesy. David set his phone on the table and played the file at low volume. 41 seconds that needed no introduction, because every person in the room had just spent 10 minutes reading documents that made the recording's meaning unmistakable. Desmond's own voice, flat and certain, telling his niece to sign a statement or carry the debt alone, and underneath it barely audible until the recording had already been isolated and cleaned by an audio technician David had hired the week before. The sound of Desmond ending the call he had been on with someone at the insurer's Milwaukee office, a call that placed him coordinating the claim's language in real time while he stood at the gangway pressuring the one person whose signature could make the fraud clean. Nobody at the table spoke for a long moment after the recording ended, and Zara let the silence sit exactly as long as it needed to, because she had learned 3 years into carrying a debt that was never supposed to be hers. That silence in a room like this belonged to whoever was willing to hold it longest. 11 weeks earlier, at a gangway lit orange by harbor lamps, Desmond Bennett had screamed at his niece, "Sign it, or I tell the FBI you opened that valve." The seat Zara occupied now was the one at the head of the table he had always taken for himself, and she had not taken it by invitation. She had taken it because the evidence on the table in front of her belonged to no one else's authority but her own. Desmond's attorney, seated to his left, had gone very still somewhere during the second document, and it was he, not Desmond, who finally spoke, asking Robert Voss in a careful, procedural voice what Lakeshore Mutual intended to do with what it had just seen. And Voss told the room plainly that the claim was denied effective immediately, that the file was being referred to the insurer's Special Investigations Unit for federal review, and that under maritime fraud statutes, a referral of this kind typically reached the Coast Guard Investigative Service and the FBI's Financial Crimes Division within days rather than weeks, given the falsified crew records already documented in the file. Great Lakes Maritime Bank's Asset Disposition Desk had, unknown to Desmond, already flagged the Bennett freight note for accelerated review the moment the fraud referral was filed, and because David Park now held that note directly, it was David, not the bank, who informed Desmond in the same meeting that the promissory note's change of control clause would not be enforced against Zara, that her name would be released from the co-signature the following week, once the paperwork cleared a decision that was David's alone to make as the note's holder, and that owed nothing to insurance law at all, only to the plain fact that he had bought the debt specifically so he could set that condition himself. Desmond did not say anything else in that room. He stood buttoned this good suit he had worn for a closing that was never going to happen, and walked out past his own attorney without a word, and it would be 9 days later, following a federal subpoena for Bennett Freight's full financial records, that agents from the FBI's Chicago field office arrested him at his own office on charges of insurance fraud and falsification of federal maritime safety records, not at the gangway, not in front of anyone who had once trusted him, but quietly on a Tuesday morning with paperwork that had taken 11 weeks to build correctly. Marion Ash had warned Zara in the weeks leading up to that meeting that federal fraud referrals moved on their own calendar, regardless of how clean the paper trail looked, that a Coast Guard Investigative Service review typically required several weeks to formalize before any arrest occurred, and that the temptation to expect handcuffs in the room itself was a temptation built by film and not by procedure. Zara had listened and had planned the meeting accordingly, not as an ending, but as the moment the evidence became undeniable to everyone who needed to see it at once. The insurer, the bank's asset desk, and Desmond himself, all in the same room at the same table, unable later to claim they had learned anything piecemeal or out of order. Robert Voss stayed behind after Desmond left, gathering the 3 documents into an evidence folder of his own, with gloved hands. And he told Zara in the plain tone of a man who had processed 100 fraud claims and rarely seen one built this cleanly by the person the fraud had targeted, that Lakeshore Mutual's Special Investigations Unit would want her full cooperation over the coming weeks, and that her meticulous chain of custody on every document time-stamped, witnessed, independently sourced, had likely shortened what could have been a year-long investigation into a matter of months. He said, almost as an aside on his way out, that in 30 years of claims work, he had never once seen a surveyor build the case against her own family with this much restraint. No confrontation, no accusation on record until the paper made it unnecessary. And Zara told him only that restraint had never felt like a choice to her. It had felt like the only inheritance her father had left that Desmond had not gotten his hands on first. Grant Whitlow finalized the note transfer paperwork the following Monday, and the change of control clause that had hung over Zara for 3 years was formally released from her name, a 2-page document she read 3 times before she believed it, sitting at her own kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold, beside her in the same chair where she had once signed her father's grief into a debt she never should have carried. David did not ask for anything in exchange for the note, and when Zara asked him directly over the phone that Monday evening what he wanted for it, he told her the truth, that he had bought the note the same week he first listened to the recording before either of them had said anything to suggest this was more than professional respect, and that whatever this was between them now had nothing to do with a debt he had already decided privately months ago that she would never carry again. It took 9 days for the federal subpoena to formalize, exactly within the range Marion Ash had predicted, and when FBI agents from the Chicago field office arrived at Bennett Freight's headquarters on a Tuesday morning, they came with a warrant built from the same documents that had sat on the conference table weeks earlier, plus 6 additional falsified logs. The Coast Guard's own review had since uncovered independently evidence that existed with or without Zara's cooperation, which was, Marion told her, exactly the point of building a case on paper instead of testimony alone. Desmond was charged with insurance fraud, wire fraud for the calls coordinating the claims language with an adjuster before the statement was finalized, and falsification of federal maritime safety records under the crew logs bearing Corey Delgado's forged initials charges that carried, his attorney told him privately, a realistic sentencing range measured in years rather than months, given the amount involved. Diane Park heard about the arrest before David called to tell her, the way she heard about most things in the shipping world, through a contact who had once done business with Bennett Freight. And when David did call expecting the lecture he had braced for since the dinner with the kimchi. Jigai. His mother surprised him by asking only one question, whether the surveyor was the same one who had made him rewrite the cargo policy. And when he said yes, Diane was quiet long enough that David asked if she was still on the line. She told him finally that she had spent 9 years measuring his worth by the seat he had refused to take at Park Maritime Group, and that watching him spend 3 weeks quietly buying a stranger's debt instead of demanding credit for it had told her something about the kind of authority he had built for himself that she had been too proud to ask about directly. It was not an apology, not fully, but it was the closest thing to one David had heard from his mother in 9 years, and he sat with it in his car outside Halcyon Terminal for a long while afterward, in the same seat where he had once listened to 41 seconds of a recording that had changed the shape of everything that came after it. Ruth Okafor called Zara the weak. The story broke in the regional shipping press not to say anything about the fraud itself, but to tell her former apprentice that she had always known the girl who tapped a hull plate with a brass hammer before trusting any gauge. Reading would one day tap something far larger than steel and find it hollow. And Zara laughed for the first time in 11 weeks. Standing in her own kitchen, the fireproof box finally empty and sitting open on the counter beside her. Desmond Bennett pleaded guilty 8 months later to a reduced set of charges: insurance fraud and falsification of federal maritime safety records, in exchange for cooperation with the ongoing investigation into 2 additional falsified claims the Coast Guard's review had since uncovered, and he was sentenced to 6 years in federal custody, along with restitution the court calculated at $4,682,955, the exact figure Lakeshore Mutual had never paid because Zara had stopped it from being claimed at all. Bennett Freight Lines was sold at auction 11 months after the arrest, its remaining vessels absorbed into 2 smaller regional carriers, and the Constance itself, repaired and recertified under an entirely new ownership structure, passed its next hull survey under a different surveyor of record because Zara had recused herself formally the day the fraud referral was filed. Unwilling to let anyone question the impartiality of the woman who had built the case against its former owner with her own 2 hands. She did not need the Constance's business. Within a year of the trial, Zara Bennett Marine Surveying operated out of an office of her own on the Harbor Road, the down payment finally spent on a lease rather than a lawyer's retainer, with Priya promoted to office manager and 2 junior surveyors. Zara had trained herself. Both of them taught from their first week to write down what they expected to find before they climbed into a tank, exactly as Ruth Okafor had once taught her. She kept the brass hammer in a case on her desk, not the original, which had finally worn smooth after 15 years of use, but a replacement Ruth had given her at the office opening engraved along the handle with 4 words. Zara had chosen herself sound does not lie. On a Sunday evening, the following spring, Zara stood in the small kitchen of the house she had bought with money that was for the first time in years entirely her own, boiling a pot of miyo-guk, the way David's mother had shown her twice, once stiffly and once months later with something close to warmth. Seaweed soup for a birthday that was not David's, but hers, a tradition. Diane Park had insisted on the first year without fully explaining why, until Zara understood it was simply how the Park family marked the people it had decided to keep. David came in from the yard with a bag of rice from the market on the corner, set it on the counter without a word, and slipped off his shoes at the door, out of a habit so old he no longer noticed himself doing it, a habit Zara had picked up too, without meaning to, somewhere in the 2 years since the conference room. There was no announcement, no proposal scene, only a sundae and a pot of soup and a small white envelope on the counter that David's mother had sent that week containing cash for no occasion. Diane had bothered to name a gesture Zara now understood well enough not to question. She had learned in the 2 years since the gangway that some inheritances came with 7-line clauses buried in fine print, and some came folded quietly into a white envelope with nothing written on it at all. And that the difference between them was not the paper, but who was standing beside you when you opened it. Zara still surveyed for insurers across the Great Lakes, still tapped every hull plate with a hammer before trusting any gauge, and she had testified twice since the trial as an expert witness in other maritime fraud cases, always the same way, numbers first, then documents, then whatever recording existed, letting the evidence carry the weight, so no one in the room could later say she had raised her voice to be believed. She thought some nights about the man who had raised her after her father died, and she found she no longer needed to hate him, to understand what he had cost her. 3 years of her 20s, a debt that was never hers, and a lesson about the difference between family and the people who simply expect to be trusted because of what they are called. The question she carried into every new survey, now climbing down a ladder into a ballast tank with a headlamp and a notebook, was not whether the steel would hold steel told the truth, eventually, no matter what anyone wrote about it on paper, but whether the people asking her to certify it would tell the truth first, and how much of her own life she was willing to spend finding out either way. Marion Ashe still sent her a card every October, the anniversary of the retainer. Zara had paid with money meant for an office she now owned outright, and each year the card said the same 6 words, still the most careful client. I've had a joke between them that had stopped being only a joke somewhere around the 2nd year. Robert Voss left Lakeshore Mutual 18 months after the trial to run the Special Investigations Unit at a larger carrier. And he called Zara occasionally when a case in the region needed a surveyor whose testimony a jury would believe without hesitation, and she always said yes, not for the fee, but because she remembered exactly what it had felt like to need someone in that role to believe her first. Corey Delgado, the deckhand whose name had been forged on 3 falsified logs, was never charged with anything, cleared entirely once the investigation confirmed his medical leave, and he sent Zara a letter that winter, short and plainly written, thanking her for the work that had kept his name out of a fraud he had never known was being built around him while he lay in a hospital bed 200 miles from Calumet Harbor. Diane Park never fully stopped hoping David would one day sit at the head of Park Maritime Group's boardroom table, but she stopped saying so out loud after the wedding, a small harborside ceremony where she stood beside her son in a hanbok she had not worn since his father's funeral, and where the only toast she gave was 4 words long. Sound does not lie, a phrase she had heard Zara say once and had apparently never forgotten. The question, the story leaves sitting at the table long after the last document has been read and the last debt released, is not whether the truth eventually surfaces. Steel and satellite data and a phone left recording under a dashboard tend to see to that on their own, but how many years a person is asked to spend quietly carrying a weight that was never theirs before someone finally asks to see the paperwork for themselves.